Assalamu alaikum everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hannah. I am a trauma coach and healing coach for Muslim women. I help Muslim women heal from complex trauma and build a beautiful life ahead of them. So if that's something that you are ready to do, then you can go to the links in my description to learn more about my trauma group coaching program. The next cohort is actually going to be right after Ramadan, which is one of my favorite cohorts to run. So that's there for anyone who is interested. The topic of this video is something I was almost like hesitant to make, but I recognize that there are topics that are going to be controversial. Maybe I'll even get some heat from it. But it is in my service in the Ummah to share what I know. And I know that divorce for so many people is such a lonely experience. And there's a lot of suffering, that an internal chaos that happens when someone is going through a divorce. So I hope to just create a bit more compassion around this topic, give you guys some honest guidance from my perspective in the work that I do, where I have helped several women who have either been in the process of divorce or post-divorce heal from divorce trauma. Let me also say that this is a video that can be very helpful for brothers who are going through a divorce. I'm not discriminating in that sense. It's just that I work with women, so that's kind of where the experience is going to come from. To quickly just put a lid on any, rumors that might come out, I am married. I'm very happily married, alhamdulillah. I don't intend to get divorced. I hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves it, that we have a beautiful, healthy marriage, protects us from ayn, protects us from our own nafs and any damage that we could do to our marriage. This is not about me. This is genuinely just putting something out there in service of Muslims who have been divorced. Let's start off with a few disclaimers, because this is probably going to end up being a little bit of a longer video, but I think it's important to start there. The conversation around divorce gets really complicated. And part of the reason is because there's a lot of just very kind of, there's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of lack of nuance when we talk about divorce. This comes from the side of Red Pill. This comes from the side of some Muslim spaces who speak about marriage from or divorce with a very hasty kind of jump to conclusions tone. And the reality of it, what I've learned very quickly, is that you never truly know what's going on behind closed doors. And there's always this conversation around, well, women are a majority who, the people that are initiating divorce. And we start drawing conclusions from statistics and research that are done on non-Muslim communities, cultures, and societies, and then overlap those with what is occurring in the Muslim community. And certainly there will be trends that are transferable, and you can kind of ascertain that it happens in the Muslim community as well. But the reality of it is that we don't know exactly what's going on. And I can only speak from my personal experience of having worked with people. And obviously there's still an inherent bias because I work with people kind of with trauma. So they're likely going to have really particular situations. But I preface with this to say that there are many times where people are getting divorced and they keep a lid on why they're actually getting divorced. It might be because they want to maintain the integrity of the person that they are divorcing from. It might be that there is serious concern or fear around consequences or repercussions of them outing the person. This is not just in the case of domestic violence. This is also in the case of psychological abuse. And we don't know. And for me personally, I get very careful about making assumptions, because when the Quran tells us, "Inna ba'd al-dhanni ithm," indeed in some suspicion is sin, the reality of it is that if you are making calls and assumptions about a person, and especially publicizing to the point that it can be considered backbiting, and you're wrong, they were actually suffering oppression behind closed doors, you are now contributing to their oppression in a way, right? We know that the supporter, the helper of the one who oppresses also gets a sin in it. And so what is it that when we shroud this conversation of divorce in shame and create such a fear of people even publicizing what they're experiencing, or make it such a dirty word, even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it halal, and he made it halal in his wisdom, I find that to be just a very counterproductive thing to do for the well-being of the ummah in its entirety. We need to be able to have healthy, honest conversations without sitting there and creating this this environment of, if I'm gonna, if someone's gonna come out and want to share why they got divorced or the suffering behind that, that immediately they're, a microscope is put on them and they're being gaslit into being told that no, actually it didn't happen. You should have been more patient. This goes on the side of brothers and sisters. So anyways, I put that out there. That's one thing I want to say. Number two is that there are many marriage coaches, female marriage coaches, who use this model of femininity, who are actually doing an extreme disservice to women who are being psychologically abused. And I take great issue in that as a trauma coach who actually has a medical background, who knows the complexity of psychiatry, who knows the research and the data on what trauma does to a person. It frustrates me. And I, as a woman, right, I appreciate femininity. From an Islamic perspective, I appreciate femininity. I can completely understand the wisdom of healthy femininity, healthy masculinity, the dynamic it creates in a marriage. I try, and to the best of my ability, to build that in my own marriage. I advise other women towards that. I have videos on femininity. But when you're sitting here telling women who you actually don't know how to ascertain whether they're truly experiencing psychological, emotional abuse, that they just need to have a pretty smile, makeup, hair done, and holding a plate and, ready for their husband when they come home. That's your advice, and everything is, just be more feminine, be more patient, be more desirable, don't voice your concerns, set your boundaries, whatever that means in the context of what some of these marriage coaches say. There are women who suffer as a result of that, because they're coming to you thinking that you actually can offer them a service, and then you have no way of telling them. You say like, oh, if your husband's abusive, but you actually don't know what abusive is actually. Like, you don't have an objective operational definition for that. There are women who continue to suffer, and not just suffer mentally, but suffer physically as well, because if you know anything about trauma, trauma stores in the body, and as a consequence to that, people literally get physically ill. This is why we take it so seriously, because it doesn't just live up here, it manifests everywhere else, and it also has a spiritual effect. And the mind-body-soul connection is something I talk about a lot. It's what I teach my clients about. I speak about it on social media, because it's so important to understand that one is not separate from the other, or all three are not separate from each other. When they listen to you and you actually don't have the background or the expertise to be able to support women of abuse or women suffering from abuse, then they maintain themselves in a situation where that damage continues long term. And when they could have gotten out earlier and started their healing and started recovering from that, they're now sustaining themselves in that suffering as a consequence to your advice, and they're telling on you. Okay, I can't tell you how many of the marriage coaches who are very popular, Muslim female feminine marriage coaches who are very popular on social media, are using a framework that was actually designed by a non-Muslim woman who, by the way, it's as someone who's did a lot of research before she got married on these resources, the woman that they tend to frame their coaching around and literally apply her framework to their coaching, was also a supporter of women allowing their men to watch adult entertainment, because he's a man and he needs that. Very counter to our deen. So it's just always odd for me to see that. Anyways, if you think you're suffering from abuse, you don't need a marriage coach who's not trained in that. You need someone who can actually help you figure out whether that's abuse or not, and objectively so, right? So go to trained mental health professionals. You can obviously go and speak to a trusted scholar who can tell you from an Islamic perspective what's going on, but that piece is really important. This is not me bashing on all marriage coaches. I'm sure there are marriage coaches that are very responsible, who have that education, but nowadays what I'm seeing is that a lot of them are just whoever comes. There's no kind of Allahumma salli Muhammad, distinguishing, right? Just like, oh, you're willing to come and you're willing to pay, come join this group. And it's very lazy. It's very lazy. As someone who, like, you have to, in order to get into my program, we go through a specific, process with you. If you're not a good fit, if I don't think we can support you, we at least point you in the direction of mental health professionals who can. That's lazy. So I'm done with my rant here. Let me continue and talk about healing after divorce. First of all, if you're watching this because you are currently going through a divorce, you're post-divorce, I just want to send my sincere, dua to you, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala heals your heart and makes it easy, whatever the next season or chapter of your life is going to be like, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it so fulfilling and so worth it that the pain that you're experiencing right now, it just becomes a thing of the past for you. The reality of it is this. Majority of people who are suffering from marriage trauma, it's from psychological or emotional abuse. And psychological/emotional abuse leaves scars that cannot be easily identified. And sometimes people don't even realize the repercussions of that abuse because they feel like maybe they're able to handle it until much later, right? Until their body has just reacted so intensely to the stress of what they experience that things start shutting down. Now these health issues are popping up. This tends to be what I see with clients. From the work that I've done with women who have been divorced, and alhamdulillah, the level of just progress and support and the extent of just mental, emotional, spiritual healing that they have been able to experience, I just want to share some tidbits of things that worked with them that I'm hoping will also work with you, whether you are a brother or sister. Number one, divorce is halal, right? We understand this. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because, once again, the conversation is often so shaming around divorce that it makes you feel like you did something sinful. And you did not do something sinful by exercising a right that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you Islamically. You can go round and round in your head of, should I have done it later? Should I have done it earlier? Should I give another chance? The reality is, even if any of that was the case, you did something halal. You do not have to live and suffer in shame. The reason I emphasize this is because trauma is held up by these pillars of toxic shame. And when we constantly sit there in shame and regret, you are hindering your healing. If you were the one who was on the receiving end of the divorce and you're genuinely trying to heal, and if it was that, especially if you were being divorced for a legitimate reason, this also applies to you. Things happen. You are allowed to grow from them. You are allowed to build from them. You are allowed to move forward and try to get better, okay? In whatever sense of the word that you are trying. The next point is, when you have experienced divorce, there is a loss there. It's almost like the death of a person who's still alive, right? There's grief that will be associated with that. And that grief is complicated, especially if now the divorce is getting messy, or there's, you're seeing a side of the person that you didn't realize. But the point is, grief is something that there's no way over it. There's only through. I've noticed so often the language around divorce for so many people is just like, pick yourself back up and go out there. And we wouldn't say that to someone who had like the loss of a parent, right? Someone had passed away. And your body is not going to allow you to do it. That's just not how our body deals with traumatic experiences, right? You might have had a divorce that was very amicable, by the way, and not traumatic. So this might not apply to you as much. But the point is, loss necessitates grief, and grief has to be experienced for it. It's almost like a cycle that needs to be run through. Because our grief is actually has a very interesting effect on the brain. And the brain has to start to dissociate the pieces of in terms of time, in terms of familiarity, actual objects, right? Things that used to remind you of this person. It starts to have to disconnect that. And that's a very jarring experience for our brain. And the emotions associated obviously are very heavy. Don't shut that down. Give yourself space to grieve. What does that mean? Literally, when you feel like you need to cry, go cry. Stop shutting it down. To the women and men who are watching this who constantly feel like they just need to get over it, it was, especially if it was just not a good marriage, it was very unhealthy, you're allowed to grieve. You can grieve the loss of the person because there might have been moments that weren't all bad and you grieve those. You can grieve the loss of the time that you spent in that marriage. You might be grieving the loss of a future. This is called ambiguous grief, right? Grief of something that you hope to attain, but you never did. So it's not actually a loss of something you had, but a loss of something you wish you could have had. Grieve that. Give your nervous system space to actually allow you to move through that. it is such an important foundation for your healing moving forward. So that's number one. Number two is there's a really important piece of accountability. Now, obviously, the kind of background of what goes on, nobody knows except for the two people. So I say this, that if there was something you did that sincerely contributed to the demise of the marriage, really holding yourself accountable to that. And in the same way that we would treat, the sins that we commit, the way Allah tells us to treat treat sins that we commit, acknowledging that it's there, muhasaba, is so important, because this is, if there was something that was going on there, this demonstrates a sickness of the heart, right? If you were extremely belittling, critical, couldn't hold your tongue, were very, very quick-tempered. These are illnesses of the heart that, from an Islamic perspective, we don't just leave that once we leave the situation. They are in us, and so we have to acknowledge them, do muhasaba to actually heal from them. That's number one. But also the point of self-forgiveness, right? Sometimes it's not that you're this person, but you feel like you turn into a person that you didn't recognize before. And there can be a lot of personal shaming of like, well, I did all of these things and I didn't know, I don't know where that came from. And so I'd ask you to be a little easier on yourself if you're constantly self-flagellating and beating yourself up, and forgive yourself. Forgive yourself for the times you gave chances that you shouldn't have. Forgive yourself for the times that you turned into a person character-wise that you weren't proud of. Forgive yourself, while also recognizing that the other person had rights too. And if you couldn't fulfill those rights or didn't fulfill those rights, that you need to make tawbah. If you can still apologize to them for that, even if they don't accept it, that's really important. But also, if you can't, if it was an abusive situation where it will just get manipulated or there's no contact or whatever the situation is, then make dua on their behalf and, pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives you for that. That is a very complicated thing to try to explain, because obviously there are so many different situations. There are people that it was, two to tango kind of situations where people, they could confidently say that they both contributed to the demise of the marriage. And then there were times where it was significantly one person who was just horrible. And so I wouldn't be telling a person who had a very serious abusive situation to go and reach out and apologize for the things that they themselves did when they were the victim of abuse. So just be mindful of kind of the nuance in that, but I hope you guys understand what I'm talking about there. The next piece is that very often post-divorce, a lot of people, what I notice, fall into dissociation. Now, what is dissociation? Dissociation is a psychological phenomenon where your brain essentially starts to disconnect your sense of perception and sensation because your nervous system can't handle the level of stimulation anymore. This can look like people completely phasing out. You could be talking to them and then all of a sudden they just don't feel like they're there. It can be at random times they just forget what they're doing. Dissociation, if you have it, you know it. Things might not feel real. You might not feel real. It's a weird way of describing it if you've never experienced dissociation. But if you do, what I just said makes complete sense to you, because you're like, yeah, that happens to me all the time, right? Dissociation is one of our nervous system's responses to protect us. And when you're dissociating, especially if it comes on suddenly, then it should tell you that your nervous system is trying to protect you because it's so overwhelmed by all that has happened. And that says a lot. And so take note of that dissociation. The way we address dissociation specifically is getting back into our body. What does that mean? Dissociation is taking you out of your mind and it's trying to disconnect you from your body, because your body is what receives the stimuli, right? And so if you're no longer paying attention, you feel like you're doing work and you're phasing out after your divorce, then nervous system regulation is really, really important to help bring you back into your body and start teaching your brain, hey, we don't have to disconnect anymore. We don't have to dissociate anymore. Yes, this was hard and it was overwhelming, but we can stay in our body. The other piece is that the reality of it, especially if you experience psychological, emotional abuse, if it was an amicable divorce, that's one thing. But if you experience that type of abuse, that's scary. That's scary. And your nervous system creates those trauma patterns because of the fear of the danger that not doing so would cause. You have to understand that your nervous system doesn't create these trauma responses or hold memories as traumatic to spite you. This is a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Allah loves us. He wants things to work for our favor. It's doing it because the harm was so significant in the perception of your brain, that it's almost like, hey, this thing was so dangerous, don't forget about it. And that is an extremely unpleasant situation because it leads to traumatization. But when you understand why it's working that way, you can have a little more compassion for the way your body's working, and then you can adjust things accordingly. The reality of it is that there are going to be core traumatic memories that occur, things that are just very triggering. And when you can process those memories accordingly, then the trauma associated with the divorce starts to fade away, and you can start rebuilding more easily. When you have those traumatic memories that are so triggering, meaning they make your heart race, maybe you dissociate very quickly if you think of them, you get emotionally overwhelmed. These are different signs of something having traumatized you, at least from the complex trauma side. Those things have to be rewired and sent into long-term memory. This is called trauma integration. So we have to teach your brain, hey, this event, it happened, it sucked, it was scary, it was hard, but it's not happening right now anymore. And there are lots of different ways that you can do this. For me, I use a few different ways with my clients. I use hypnotherapy, which is halal, at least the way I use it is halal. It's a really great trauma integration technique. I use a very specific type of journaling method that is designed to follow the principles of trauma integration. There is somatic processing, which is a really cool way of doing it as well. So those are what I use with my clients. But the point is, somehow, some way, those traumatic memories need to be rewired and set back. Otherwise, your brain's gonna make you feel like you're stuck in that time period, quite literally. Like it'll treat it almost as if what occurred then is happening now. And you can't heal, because healing is moving forward too in a healthy way, right? From something that happened if your brain is treating it like it's happening right now. The next piece that's super important to remember is that, or the final piece, I believe, is that life redesigning is really important. If you've grieved appropriately and you have taken accountability if there was any fault on you in the marriage, if you have done the nervous system regulation work to address the dissociation, and then you've done the trauma integration work to get rid of those, or not get rid of, rewire those traumatic memories from the time that you were married, life redesigning looks like, I've done that work. Now who am I going to be moving forward? And I want to emphasize something really important, because it makes me so upset the way we're so the word that I want to use is slipping my mind, but we're just very discouraging to divorce brothers and sisters, who many of which are genuinely good people who just had a really sucky situation, right? You don't listen to people that are like, it's going to be so hard to get married again now, and this and that. Listen, if that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wrote for you, for it to be difficult, it is what it is, right? You're not, when we take what people say and accept it as truth, that becomes what drives our behavior, right? And so if you believe wholeheartedly, if you're a Muslim man or woman who got divorced and everyone's saying it's gonna be so hard, you're not gonna be able to, now you're this age, now you're that, no one's gonna want this kind of person, how likely are you going to be to try? How likely are you gonna be to look? Who can dictate your rizq except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So don't let other people dictate what you perceive as possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because anything is possible. And the reality of it is, there were Sahaba and Sahabiyat who were divorced and they got remarried, and there was no issue. There are plenty of people that I know who have been divorced, who got remarried, and alhamdulillah, it was the second story was the best story. So I ask you to really, as much as you can, set very healthy standards for yourself of what advice you will take versus what advice you would reject. Don't let people discourage you. You're already going through a difficult enough time. If this is something you want, you make dua for it, you build yourself into a really great wife or a really great husband, you learn from your experiences, and you move forward and you try. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills it for you, it will happen. Not a single person will stop it. And if it was not willed for you, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has something better. Marriage is not the end all be all. I can tell you, I know plenty of people who said, oh, if I had known that marriage was going to be like this, I would have never gotten married. It's a sad reality, but it's true, right? It is not the only thing in the world. Anyways, you guys, I know this was a super long video, but I'm probably talking like a mile a minute, but I hope it was super helpful for you. I will briefly summarize what I said. So the first piece is just be very like empathetic towards yourself. The second piece, I believe, was about dissociation and nervousness, making sure you address this dissociation, because if you don't, you're going to stay stuck in the trauma for a very long time. Make sure that you are actually taking accountability. This is a point that's really important, but also be extremely self-compassionate and self-forgiving, because sometimes just the worst gets brought out of you. Shaitan takes advantage, and beating yourself over the head all the time for that isn't going to be conducive or constructive to your well-being in your healing. This doesn't mean you ignore it. This doesn't mean you excuse it. You do the work to make on your character, to ensure that that doesn't happen again. But it doesn't have to define your identity. Integrate the memories, work with someone who can help you do this. Look for trauma-informed people. I obviously, as a trauma coach, this is what I do. So for the ladies who are watching this, join the group coaching program. I have lots of ladies who've experienced a divorce who had tremendous benefit from it. So that is there for you as a resource. This is basically the only group coaching program that exists in the way that exists in terms of addressing trauma at the body, mind, and soul level. Nobody has been able to successfully recreate it, and there's a reason. There's no other coach, at least that I know of, who is Muslim and who's also a medical professional with the background that I have and the Islamic background that I have that can create a program in this way. So it's designed to support you. Take it as a resource if you're able to, inshallah. Otherwise, if you decide to work with someone else, make sure they are trauma informed, and do not be using talk therapy. Don't be, if they're telling you to speak about your trauma and that's all that the work is, say no, thank you, next. Go find someone who does actual trauma-based practices like EMDR. There's brain spotting. There's a bunch of different ones that exist, but find someone who can support you in that. And life redesigning. You get to decide who you will be in character, in taqwa. You own that. Don't let other people tell you who you can and can't be, what you can and can't have. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decision to make for you, what your risk is. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. Comment supportive advice. You will immediately get your comment deleted if you're rude. Okay, this is not the space for that. My channel is not the space for that. You go find some other YouTube channel to be rude and negative about. This is also not the space to complain about your ex. Just words of encouragement, advice, and dua for people. Assalamu alaikum.